romance and sacrifice and martyrdom, everything else. But when it comes to diarrhea, when it comes to stomach ache, when it comes to headache, there is a poverty of language. We don't know how to represent it. So at the heart of the essay is a crisis of representation, because language is very normative. Language is very ableist in a certain sense. Language is designed to be powerful. Language is designed to be evocative. It's designed to be very patriarchal, masculinist, phallogocentric. We can go and bring back the Derrida over here as well. The phallogocentricity about language. Our language is tied to authority, power, question, surveillance, and all the rest of it. So what happens when a subject is sick, when a subject is deterritorialized, when a subject becomes interrupted? And that's the term I use very often in my engagement in medical humanities, interruption, the idea of the interrupted subject, the subject which is sidelined, the subject which suddenly becomes dysfunctional, suddenly becomes strange, etc. So Woolf, Virginia Woolf, in that essay on being ill, she makes a really interesting theoretical stand over there in terms of looking at the poverty of language, the crisis of representation when it comes to articulating sickness. As she says, how there are epithets after epithets available to any writer when it comes to romance or martyrdom or heroism or saga and all the rest of it. And yet, ask the same writer to talk about ulcer, to talk about liver pain, to talk about headache, and language runs dry. So I recommend it very heavily. I suggest all of you read it, because it's like you see, I mean, you can probably see it right away. It's a funny essay because it talks about how headache doesn't have a language, ulcer doesn't have a language, spleen doesn't have a language, right? So there's this poverty of metaphors when it comes to representing sickness as well. But that is exactly what we're talking about, how language is by default very ableist in quality. And we're talking about people who are differently abled, or people who become quote unquote dysfunctional. Our language becomes something of a crisis at that particular point in time. The third theory, the third proposition that I offer for colleagues to dwell on is the idea of the unavailability of language, or the politics of representation in medical humanities. Because if you remember, I talked about deconstruction at the very beginning of this session. I talked about how the fundamental spirit, the fundamental attitude in medical humanities is deconstructive in quality, because it does away with dualisms, it critiques dualisms, binaries, and it looks at the more interstitial passageways between health and non-health, between sick and non-sick, between happiness and crisis, etc. Right? So it becomes very non-normative in quality as well. Now, in that sense, we can see how medical humanities begins to connect with something which we now call disability studies, because it talks about the whole politics of ability. So how do you define ability against which the subject is compared and contrasted? Because what is the touchstone when it comes to ability? The whole political production of the able body, the ableist body. Again, we can see how this connects to authority, power, question, and all those phallogocentric principles against which the subject must be matched, must be compared and contrasted. Anyone who doesn't do it or doesn't come up as an able match is very conveniently labeled as differently abled or disabled. Now, we can see how I'm using the word labeled over here, because a large part of medical humanities is also a critique of the politics of profiling, the politics of identity formation. So how do certain subjects get profiled as interrupted subjects, as problem subjects, etc. Now that we spent a little bit of time, for about 20 minutes, we spent some time talking about the different theoretical principles that one can look at when we study medical humanities. Let's take a look at some of the texts. I'll use 3 texts mainly, all very familiar texts that one can look at. And again, I'm using familiar text because that I would like the colleagues over here to be familiar with the text, just so we can see how the interactions work, how the particular interpretative prism may be mapped onto these things. The first text that I'm going to look at in some details is again a Virginia Woolf novel, which I'm hoping most of you have read. It's a novel called Mrs. Dalloway. Now, if you read Mrs. Dalloway, and I've got a paper of Mrs. Dalloway, again in a book titled The Body in Pain, The Male Body in Pain, sorry, where again I'll talk about the suffering male body, the traumatized male body, what we call hysteria. Again, if you look at the politics of hysteria, if you read Showalter's study of hysteria, Ellen Showalter, you'll find that hysteria very conventionally was labeled as a female malady, right, as something which happened only to women. And yet, if you look at the First World War or post-First World War fiction, which is the time in which most medical humanities historians, they begin to look at that particular period very seriously, because that was the period, that was the political event after which we began to see, or doctors began to see, or even normal people began to see men, otherwise very strong, powerful, grown adult men, begin to behave like quote-unquote hysterics. And interestingly, this was a time also, unsurprisingly, where Sigmund Freud became very, very important in London, in the Western world. Because, you know, prior to that, if you read Freud's history, before First World War, when Freud was in Vienna, he wasn't really taken seriously as a doctor. But, you know, his significance shot up really after First World War, primarily because he was offering a therapy for cure, psychoanalysis through the dream, through the subconscious, and, you know, different kinds of healing procedures, which were working apparently at that point of time. But the important thing is how there was a regendering of sickness that took place after First World War. So what was called hysteria had to be given a different name. Again, the naming in medicine is very important, because you find that there's a lot of politics which is at play, the very naming of a disease, because, you know, there are gendered implications, there are racial implications, there are all kinds of implications in a very politics of calling a disease something or classifying a disease something. So the politics of nosological classification, in the sense of giving a name to a disease, is often already embedded in racial, gendered, discriminatory politics, right? So, for example, when the big men, the big strong men, began to show symptoms of what was called hysteria, it had to be given a different name. So it was called shell shock for a while. It was, you know, called different kinds of traumatic names for a while. And only after this Vietnam War, as recent as the Vietnam War, did the medical classification, the medical dictionary, come up with a term which we now call today, which we now use today, which happens to be post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So in fact, one of my PhD scholars just finished a PhD. She's working in Delhi now, but her thesis was in Vietnam War fiction. The whole idea of looking at trauma in Vietnam War fiction. Again, the whole idea of giving a name to it became a political thing, because, you know, you had to call it something else, because you can't have men behave like hysterics. So there was that sexist politics at play. Now you can see how even something as hardcore technical as a disease is always connected, also connected to all these different kinds of cultural politics, gendered politics, racial politics, etc. Now, so if you look at Mrs. Dalloway, we find that, you know, it's a familiar text, as some of you would know. It's about a soldier who comes back from the First World War, a man called Septimus Smith. And Septimus Smith, of course, is this big white man who has been a soldier once upon a time, who was this big hero once upon a time. But back in London after the war, he begins to behave like a disintegrated subject. He begins to behave like an interrupted subject. He can't function properly. He has all these traumatic triggers. He has all these haunted dreams. He dreams about, he has survivor's guilt. As you know, survivor's guilt is a very common thing among soldiers. When they come back after the war, they feel guilty about being alive because they saw some of their friends die in the war. So there's a lot of that in Septimus Smith as well. And the whole novel is a very graphic and very moving description of Septimus' psychological state, his mental, emotional, nervous state. But it becomes more dark than that. It's a very dark novel because it also talks about how Septimus, or the man who comes back after the First World War, is massively mistreated. It's almost criminally mistreated and abused by contemporary medical practitioners. And there are two doctors in the novel, Holmes and Bradshaw, who refuse to look at Septimus as anything outside of a cultural problem. They keep saying everything is okay with him, nothing is wrong with him. He should, quote unquote, man up. He should play cricket. He should exercise. He should take care of himself like a proper man. So you find how all this very gendered vocabulary is used in what is passed off as medicine, what is passed off as a medical healing practice. So we find that Woolf's novel makes very clear that even technical medical healing practices are always already embedded and implicated and inclusive with different practices of power, different practices of identity politics, different practices of gender, racial politics, right? So that's something which you see throughout the novel, Mrs. Jalloway. And of course, I'm not going to go into depth in the novel because I'm assuming most of you read it. But you know, if you remember the scene in which Septimus jumps from a window and kills himself because he feels that he is threatened and attacked by all these medical officers who are coming to essentially capture him, arrest him. You find that the entire novel it gives you a very interesting idea, a very interesting picture, image of the collusion between power and medicine. While the doctors behave like policemen, but the doctors behave like people who are more interested in confining and coercing the suffering subject rather than healing them, right? So the whole idea of healing becomes very interestingly, translated into coercion, surveillance, different forms of tyrannical principles through which the sick subject must be brought into some kind of a corrective measure. And the corrective measure in Mrs. Jalloway is a very Boy Scout kind of a vocabulary. You should exercise, you should take a bath, you should play cricket, you should, take care of yourself in a very muscular kind of way. So it's a very male vocabulary that is used to further marginalize, further shame the suffering subject. And this allows me to come to the other big emotion in medical humanities, which is shame. The whole idea of the social construct of shame, the idea of the shameful suffering subject, because the whole idea of the sickness being shameful, particularly when it gets connected to different kinds of gendered, racial vocabulary. Now, that scene in Mrs. Jalloway, when Septimus jumps from a window because he can hear footsteps of the I was about to say policemen, but doctors, so you can see how even the Freudian slip makes sense, because the doctors behave like policemen in that novel, and as they're coming up the staircases, Septimus hears that, and he jumps from a window and kills himself. So it's a very tragic suicide. But interestingly and brutally, really, mercilessly, Holmes, who is coming up to look at Septimus, the doctor, the word that he uses when he sees Septimus jumping from a window is coward, right? So again, there's a sense of emasculation that takes place with the suicide, a sense of shame, embarrassment that takes place with suicide. So instead of healing the subject is judged. So a very judgmental gaze of medicine, the very coercive, tyrannical gaze of medicine is something which is critiqued and very dramatically described in the novel, Mrs. Jalloway. So the whole novel becomes a very interesting study of the tragedy of the human subject, the suffering subject, who is obviously trying to heal, but at the same time, he is massively abused, massively mistreated by the contemporary medical apparatus around him. And it's one of the early novels, really, which is cited extensively in medical humanities, particularly because it gives you a sense of the suffering subject's dislocation apropos of the functional and grammatical vocabulary of civilian society, of a very normative society, which has very little patience, very little empathy, or very little consideration for the sick subject, right? So Septimus becomes a problem which must be fixed rather than a suffering sick man who must be healed. In fact, if you read a lot of post-First World War poetry, in the poems of Owen and Sassoon and Graves, you find that a large part of that crisis is about the misunderstood suffering subject, because the subject who's coming back after the war is misunderstood, is seen as a problem, is seen as a malingerer, someone who's pretending to be sick but not actually sick. So all these different politics of discrimination, shame, misalignment are used in those novels as well. Now, the next novel, the next short story that I'm going to read a little bit is, again, very familiar. It is a partition short story. It's a story by Siddharth Hassan Manto, a story called Toba Tek Singh. So Toba Tek Singh, as you know, is one of the most iconic short stories about partition. It's originally written in Urdu, but of course, I read that in translation, and I'm guessing most of our colleagues over here will also know what Toba Tek Singh is about. So Toba Tek Singh is set in an asylum in Lahore. So the very site is a medical site. It's where quote unquote mad people are kept. And it's a very interesting short story because it talks about the collusion between medicine and bureaucracy in a very Foucauldian sense. So again, I am not going to go into details of what the story is about because I'm guessing you already know it. But it's interesting to see how Toba takes Singh, the very short story by Panto, it talks about how the healing space of the asylum, which is supposed to heal the suffering subject, actually becomes a surveillance space. It becomes a space where bureaucracy is massively operative, rampantly operative. And the story about how post-partition, there are these series of very bureaucratic meetings between the two new nation states, India and Pakistan, obviously, and how it is decided in those bureaucratic meetings how the madmen should also be sent across the borders depending on the religious identity. So all the Muslim madmen will be sent from India to Pakistan, and the Hindu and Sikh madmen will be sent from Pakistan to India. And the whole story is set in a Lahore asylum. So obviously this is contemporary Pakistan, and it's about a suffering subject called Bishain Singh. So Bishain Singh is this typical, it's almost like a caricature of the mad person who has no memory of what happened to him recently, but he remembers things which happened many, many years ago. And so it is called, in technical terms, it is called anterogate amnesia. It's a special kind of amnesia which doesn't allow the subject to make new memories, although he has memories many years ago. So anyway, we're not going into those details. But the interesting thing about the short story is how Bishain Singh, when it comes to know of the two new nation states, of how he will be sent across the borders because of his religious identity. So we can see how cultural identity, politics, and medicine are colluding together in this novel as well. Now he doesn't want to go to either India or Pakistan. All he wants to go is his own village, which is called Toba Tek Singh. Now he keeps on asking everyone where Toba Tek Singh is. And of course, no one knows where Toba Tek Singh is because it's a small village. It is insignificant in the scale of things because we have those two big nation states which have taken over, two new landmasses, two new narratives which are being formed, and no one has any patience to engage with the sick man who wants to go to his village, his little village called Toba Tek Singh. So the entire short story is about the madman's very tragic navigations in terms of space and time. And when we come to the end of the short story, we find that when he's about to be sent over across the border, he runs away from the bureaucrats, and he comes to what is called the no man's land between India and Pakistan. And he stands there with his swollen feet. And again, the swollen feet in this particular story is very important symbolically because if you remember, the second proposition I talked about is the relationship between corporeality and identity. So the swollen feet is a corporeal quality. The feet, the body, part of the body, a limb has swollen. Obviously, it's a medical condition. It's a condition of sickness. We are also told that he hasn't slept for many days. He keeps on standing, and it almost becomes like an atlas as such. But at the same time, the swollen feet or the madman standing with the swollen feet in no man's land also becomes some kind of an identity of resistance, an identity of subversion, an identity which refuses to engage with any of the normative categories which are handed down to him. And the story ends, as you know, with Bishain Singh dying, falling down on that no man's land. And then in the end, the narrator tells us in that stretch of land between the two nation states, between the two new nations, lay Toba Tek Singh. So he morphs, as it were, into that landmass, into the forgotten village. So his corporeal identity, as in his soul and body, his medical identity, as in his quote-unquote madness, sort of merges into his political identity, and it becomes Toba Tek Singh, right? It becomes that landmass which had been forgotten. But it is the refusal to forget, it's a refusal to unremember, which really makes this short story so interesting, which is why this story is cited extensively. I've got an article as well where I look at the relationship between memory and medicine in Toba Tek Singh. So it is one of those go-to texts for any researcher who is interested in the intersections between, let's say, memory studies and medical humanities. So Toba Tek Singh is a really, really rich text that I recommend very heavily because it talks about all the things we just mentioned, corporeality, identity, the whole idea of language. So we find in Toba Texing, as well as in the earlier text I mentioned with Dalloway, language becomes a very important issue, because even in Woolf's novel, Septimus is speaking a language which, quote unquote, doesn't make sense to the very hegemonic masculine doctors around him. So he is seen as this essentially meaningless man, right? So again, we can see how meaning, corporeality, sickness, health, they all come together in very interesting ways. How meaning becomes a tyrannical construct, meaning becomes a cultural construct. So anyone who doesn't make meaningful sense is seen as a sick subject. So the production of sickness and health are also sort of almost cosmetically and culturally constructed in many ways. So we find similar things happening in Manto's short story as well, where we see this sort of quote unquote madman who is muttering something which people don't know or understand, and the police officers and the wardens of the asylum are laughing at him because he's seen as this meaningless madman. But at the same time, what the story tells us, especially towards the end, is how Bishan Singh's quote unquote meaninglessness actually becomes an act of subversion, because he's saying something that no one understands. And in saying that, he's refusing to reify himself as an assimilated subject. So the refusal to be reified, to be commodified into some kind of identity politics which is governed by state is something which Toba Texing offers in a very deconstructive way. So it's a wonderful short story that I recommend very, very heavily. I'll move on now to the two final texts. So I said three at the beginning, but I realized I will bring in one more text before I move on to the big final text, because I think it's important to note that third text as well. It's not really a short story or a work of fiction. In fact, it is a work of non-fiction, but I recommend it very, very heavily, especially anyone who's interested to do extensive research in medical humanities, particularly in relation to how looking at sickness, medicine, health, through, let's say, a post-colonial lens, a lens of post-colonial or colonial violence, territorialization, surveillance, etc. And I think there's no better figure to study this than Frantz Fanon. So if you read Fanon, and again, I'm sure most of the colleagues over here will have read Fanon, would have read Fanon, in terms of looking at how Fanon, as you know, was a trained psychiatrist, as well as being a post-colonial philosopher and theorist. So if you read his really interesting work called Wretched of the Earth, towards the end of the book, Wretched of the Earth, where he talks about Algeria, he talks about the Algerian resistance to French colonization, this very, very violent armed resistance against French colonization, and also how the colonial territorialization, colonial violence also created nervous conditions in the sense that there are all these different case studies towards the end of the Wretched of the Earth. So as you know, like I said, Fanon was a psychiatrist. He was a trained psychiatrist. He studied medicine at the same time while also being a philosopher, a theorist of the highest order. So you find in Fanon the very interesting intersection between health, between medicine, medical politics, but also the very interesting identity politics around surveillance, terror, violence that were rampant during colonization or during processes of decolonization, right? So we find that he's got an entire essay in that book called Decolonizing the Mind or Decolonization. It talks about the mental effects of colonization in terms of what it does to the subject, the sense of inferiority, the sense of discrimination, the sense of marginalization. And of course, if you add violence to it, corporeal violence, then obviously that can sometimes result in very dark and very complex psychiatric conditions, psychological conditions. So the case studies at the end of the Wretched of the Earth are really interesting insights into how corporeality, identity, violence, terror, political paradigms are all embedded together, are all implicated together in the study of sickness and the study of health, right? So again, Fanon becomes a really interesting case study, and I'm not going to go into details of Fanon, but it's worth mentioning just in case you haven't read Fanon. You should absolutely, if you're interested in doing any serious research in medicine and humanities and empathy and care, particularly in terms of how all these things connect to political identities, to conditions of post-coloniality, to conditions of violence in colonial, post-colonial conditions. So, Fano, of course, and this is what I mentioned at the beginning. So, if you look at medical humanities, you find that there is a horizontality about medical humanities because there is a cultural context and you move across space and time. But at the same time, there is a longitudinal quality in medical humanities because you're also getting a glimpse of the mind, a glimpse of interiority inside the suffering subject. So we find in Fano that is a perfect example, a perfect case study of the horizontality as well as the longitudinal quality of suffering. Because it talks about psychological trauma, it talks about abuse, it talks about violence, and how different case studies towards the end of the particular book are really moving examples, very disturbing, moving examples of what political terror, political violence can cause in terms of real medical conditions of sickness and psychological disturbance and anxiety. So I recommend Wretched of the Earth very, very heavily. But with that, let me now move on to the final text that I will talk a little bit about. It's a novel about medical humanities. It's a novel that it was very big when I was finishing my PhD. In fact, my last chapter of my thesis was on that. Also, my second book, the last chapter is again, a large part of that is jumped from that novel. It's a novel called Saturday by Ian McCohen. McCohen, obviously, being this British writer, and it's a novel which is classified sometimes in the subgenre called neuro novel. Now, as you know, neuro as a neuroscience and novel, obviously fiction. So neuro novel was that subgenre in fiction which became very prominent in the early part of 21st century, where lots of writers, McCohen, Ishiguro, and lots of writers in the generation were writing novels, while also drawing on neuroscience, but also drawing on psychology in terms of understanding, trying to get a better, more complex understanding of mindfulness, consciousness, cognition, in all kinds of ways, both cognitive as well as clinical ways. Because when you talk about the mind, there are two broad aspects one can look at the mind with. One is the cognitive aspect, the other is the clinical aspect, right? In terms of looking at illness through a clinical perspective, which is more connected to what we look at in medical humanities. So just to give you a sense of what the novel is about, the protagonist of the novel is called Saturday, by the way. The novel is called Saturday. It is about one day in London, and the one day happens to be the day of the protest march against the Iraq War in 2003. So again, we can see how it is situated within a particular political context. So this is the day of the big march in London, where some of you know, people went out on the streets with banners, "Not in my name," protesting against the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So that is the context in which the novel is situated. But that's the political context. So what happens in the rest of the novel is very, very medical, because we see there's a neurosurgeon who is the protagonist in the novel. Just to give you a very quick summary. So he has this encounter in the street with a typical troublemaker called Baxter. Baxter is this typical football hooligan in England who wears sneakers, who does drugs. His car crashes against the neurosurgeon's car, and he's about to come out of the car and about to pull out the neurosurgeon and give him a good beating, as troublemakers do. Now, at that point in time, the neurosurgeon, who's called Henry Perron, he notices a nervous movement under Baxter's eye, and he exposes that in front of Baxter's cronies. He says, "You have a nervous condition. It's called Hutchinson's disease. It's a degenerative disease. You're not going to live much longer. You should get that treated, etc., etc." Obviously, this medical information is something which emasculates Baxter, the troublemaker. So you can see how medicine is weaponized in the novel also. Or the doctor who is weaker in the body, who doesn't have any arms with him, doesn't have any ammunition with him, uses the medical knowledge as an ammunition to emasculate the other subjects. So you can see the collision between medicine, knowledge, power, masculinity, all coming together. Obviously, that is a big insult to Baxter because it is exposed that in front of his followers and sycophants and the mates around him that he has this nervous condition. And using that confusion, Perron, the neurosurgeon, escapes. He manages to escape the situation, which obviously would have ended up in him getting beaten. Now, of course, the novel doesn't end over there. Towards the end of the novel, Baxter comes back for retribution. He comes to Perron's house in London. He attacks Perron's family members and is about to attack his daughter when he notices a book of poems on the kitchen cabinet. So he asks the daughter to pick up the book and read him a poem, and the daughter does it. And the poem that she happens to read is a poem called Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. So again, as some of you know, Dover Beach is a really, really moving poem about the spiritual, cultural, cognitive confusion that happened with Darwinism, right? Where the Darwinian thing came into being, this absolute faithlessness which was created at that point of time. Dover Beach becomes a very moving, poetic rendition of that moment of faithlessness. So that poem is read out towards the end of the novel, Saturday. Now, interestingly, this is the really interesting bit in the novel where the typical troublemaker who has never been to university, school dropout presumably, listens to the poem, Dover Beach, and changes his mind. He begins to get soft, he begins to get mellow, he drops his knife and he becomes less and less hostile. And he asks the daughter to read the poem again and again. And the neurosurgeon who's observing the whole thing comes to know, comes to understand, comes to realize that this is how the mind operates. And he, as a neurosurgeon, can know about nerves and cells and neurons and the brain, but he has absolutely no understanding of the mind because he has no idea how art, poetry, affect can make a subject change their mind. So this is something beyond science. So in a certain sense, the novel also becomes a critique of science, a critique of neuroscience. And it's also an invitation that in order to understand the human mind, we must move beyond neuroscience. We must move beyond cells and synapses and neurons, and also look at culture, also look at affect, also look at literature. And the novel ends very movingly in the neurosurgeon Perron is about to do another operation in the theater and is looking at a brain. And it's a very epiphanic moment in the novel. In fact, it's very modernist. If you read the novel, it's a lot like Ulysses and James Joyce. That's why it's a one-day novel, like Ulysses. It's about one day in London in that sense. So he's looking at the brain and he realizes, I know what this is in terms of its cellular structure. I know what this is in terms of its neural structure, as a neural net, but I have no idea how the brain becomes a mind, how the mind becomes a self, how the self becomes a subject, and how the subject becomes a citizen, right? And again, the novel ends with the Iraq War. The novel ends with the, another city in Baghdad is about to get bombed. The political condition comes back, but it's a fantastic novel, really, if you want to read about the collusion between medicine, empathy, literature, and politics. So Saturday, the novel, is a must-read if you're interested in looking at the relationship between medicine, empathy, consciousness, and politics. So that is the long and short of it, really, in terms of some of the texts you can look at. Of course, there are many other texts you can read. I just touched upon a few. I started with Virginia Woolf's essay on being ill. I mentioned her novel, Mrs. Dalloway. I mentioned the Sadat Hassan Manto short story, Toba Take Sing. I also mentioned Frantz Fanon's text, Wretched of the Earth, in terms of looking at post-colonial trauma, violence, and psychiatric conditions in collusion with political conditions. And I ended my session looking at what is called a neuronovel, Saturday by Ian McEwan, which is about neuroscience and empathy and literature and affect in terms of political turbulence and crisis. So as you can see, medical humanities is it's a very complex field. It's one of those fields like memory studies, which is very organically interdisciplinary in quality. You don't have to try hard to be interdisciplinary. It's very interdisciplinary in many ways. So you can't do a really serious research in medical humanities, particularly in an interdisciplinary way, unless you know something about psychology, unless you also bring in phenomenology, unless you also bring in anthropology, and of course, unless you also bring in literary studies. So all these different fields really lend themselves individually as well as intersectionally in order to make medical humanities such a fascinating paradigm, which really attracts researchers, scholars, academics from all across the world, because it is a field which is very, very culture sensitive, context sensitive, because you need to know the site of trauma, the site of illness. What is the space and time in which the subject is suffering, where the subject is suffering? But at the same time, it goes beyond that. It goes into the subject's mind, into the subject's body, which is why corporeality, identity, phenomenality, affect, discursivity, all these things come together to create this complex epistemic apparatus of medical humanities. So with that, I end my session. I'm happy to take a few questions, and thank you very much again for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. As you mentioned that medical humanities is a complex field, you made it so simple to understand. Sir, I have a question.
Sure, please.
Sir, in Indian context, medical humanities is entirely new. And whenever we do a research, when scholars do a research on medical humanities, they always ask for Indian theorists or any critics on medical humanities. So, any Indian theorist or critic we have in India, sir?
Yeah. I mean, see, you can look at many anthropologists who work on medicine. So there's someone called Nainika Mukherjee who works on trauma. I mean, she's an anthropologist, but she also works in medical anthropology. So she's a very good person to look at. Aki Mukherjee, who works on poverty and psychoanalysis, is again a very, very good figure. And Aki Mukherjee, she happened to be my external examiner from my PhD, and she is a professor in Oxford University. But her work increasingly is about the global South, and in terms of how poverty, psychoanalysis, mental health conditions are connected together in very complex geopolitical ways. So these are the two big names that I can think of right now, Nainika Mukherjee and Aki Mukherjee. I publish also in medical humanities. If colleagues would like to read some of my works in medical humanities, I'm very happy to send PDFs. So I published on surrogacy in India. I published in the whole idea of new liberal genetic engineering happening in the global South in terms of the whole politics of, let's say, adoption, for example. And that, again, is a very big project now, the politics of adoption, the racial politics of adoption. Nainika Mukherjee's work is also on that, the racial politics of adoption, how the sort of wealthy white people are adopting, quote-unquote, poor children from the global South. So what are the racial politics of privilege which are implicated in that kind of thing? So I think these are some of the areas that I can mention. But the other thing that I should mention is it's a very good question, is that particularly in a post-internet age, we must move away from the binary between West and non-West, right? Because that binary doesn't really work anymore. I mean, it really becomes a bit reductionist today to talk about Western critiques and non-Western critiques. I mean, it was a very big thing, let's say, when Edward Said was writing Orientalism, right? Absolutely. But in a post-internet, post-localized world, where the global is also local and local is also global, we need to be a little bit more deconstructive in our understanding of knowledge systems. So, yes.
Sir, participants, your mic, you can unmute, and if you have any questions, you can ask, sir. Or you can post your questions in chat box.
So there is one question.
Sure. Please go ahead.
Yeah. If there is any specific methodologies that needs to be followed, if so, could you suggest the sources that need to be referred to? This is the question which has been posted by Godson D. Paul. It's in the chat box. Yes, sir.
Excellent question. Thank you. So there are quantitative as well as qualitative methodologies in medical humanities, depending on what kind of research you're interested in. I mean, if you are more oriented towards anthropological research, then obviously you need to have quantitative empirical data in terms of looking at field studies, interviews. Let's say you're talking to trauma victims or abuse victims, and obviously that data is very important, and you want to integrate that data using also theoretical methods. So my quick response will be a very healthy and symmetrical mix of qualitative as well as quantitative methodologies. So it is data-centric in many ways. If you're looking at anthropology, if you're looking at human subjects as your case studies, at the same time also using theories of psychology, theories of trauma, theories of post-coloniality to understand the psychological cultural conditions. The other thing is, if it is more oriented towards see, it's medical humanities, so it's like a compound thing, right? If it's more oriented towards the medical, then obviously I think you require more clinical data in terms of looking at case studies of depression, case studies of anxiety, case studies, medical case studies. So I think a very healthy mixture of medical data, anthropological data, integrated with theoretical apparatuses, that would make a really good paper in medical humanities.
Sir, one more question, sir.
Please go ahead.
Sir, we always, especially literature, it always deals with the human problems. And we can, if, for example, my area is environmental humanities, I can correlate environment and medicine and gender with medicine. And almost all the studies, all the theories we can connect with medical conditions. So when we do a research, or when the scholar is doing a research, for example, my scholar is doing on gerontology. So how there is a possibility of overlapping of one theory. So how can we make it completely a medical humanities aspect? Because there is a possibility that we give more importance to environment, or overlapping will be always there. So how to avoid that in a research, sir, especially with respect to medical humanities?
I mean, it's an excellent question. The same problem is in memory studies, actually, because I think it's easy to get seduced by these concepts and get a little bit too pulled in that direction, right? I mean, make it entirely medical, entirely memory-centric, etc. But I think one has to be honest about one's disciplinary location. That honesty is absolutely important, because if you're looking at, let's say, gerontology or geriatric masculinity or something like that, right? Then the focus should be on that rather than getting swayed by the new theories from memory studies or medical humanities, because that, if you do that, it makes the research more dilute in quality. It is okay to draw on these theories. It is okay to draw on these new theories which are coming in from external sources like medical humanities or memory studies or disability studies, etc. But I think if your focus is on eco-criticism, if your focus is on geriatric identity or something like that, that should be the foreground. That should be the primary spine of your research. And it is okay if you supplement it with the theoretical things. And that's something that I always advise scholars, that once you define your discipline, you need to stick there honestly and not get too seduced by what is fashionable. Now, of course, if your area is directly medical humanities, then of course it is a very different thing, because then you're looking at illness, you're looking at depression, you're looking at anxiety, schizophrenia, and all these different things. That is the foreground of your research, right? But if you're working on something allied to medical humanities, you must make a decision in terms of what is the primary research, what's the secondary research. And that distinction should be very, very clear. Otherwise, like we said, it just becomes a little bit messy and very asymmetrically mixed, which then makes the whole research dilute in quality. So that is where the supervisor's role comes in terms of reining in the scholar, advising the scholar not to be swayed by what is in the air, not to be swayed by what is fashionable. But once you define the discipline, stick to it and make it richer by bringing in supplements from other disciplines, but not at the cost of the original discipline. So that's what I tell my scholars also in memory studies.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Any questions from the participants? Feedback form is circulated. I request the participants to fill the feedback. Now it's time to thank sir. So thank you for the engaging and insightful session by giving literary examples, Mrs. Dalloway, No Man's Land also you have mentioned in your session, and the recent one, the Saturday, by giving all these literary examples, and you have illustrated how literature brings out the emotional and psychological dimensions of human health, and the way you narrated the themes of mental health and trauma, the thought-provoking perspectives will surely resonate with us as we continue to explore this intersection of sciences and medical humanities. On behalf of the department and on behalf of the participants, I thank you once again for this wonderful session, sir. Thank you for being with us today. Immediately when we called, you accepted the invitation, and we asked you to give a session on medical humanities. You immediately accepted. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for being here, sharing your insights with us. I hope this will be a fruitful session for all the scholars who are doing research. Uh, on medical humanities and memory studies. For sure, in future, we'll have a session on memory studies also, sir. Thank you so
Thank you
much,
so
sir.
much. Thank
Thank you
you
for
for
being with us today.
I mean, thanks to your invitation because this allowed me to go back to medical humanities because my PhD was in medical humanities.
Oh,
Moved to memory studies. So thanks to you, I had to go back and read my thesis again. So it was a very good experience for me too. Thank you very
thank
much.
you, sir. Thank you, sir. I
Take care.
thank all the participants and I request you all to join at 2 p.m. for the next session today. Thank you all. Thank you,
I'll,
sir.
I'll take your leave. Thank you.